Brilliant. Well, this is exciting to be here back in Adelaide. I've only come back last year after a decade overseas. I love what you've done with the place. The Oval's looking fantastic. Very exciting. Today I wanted to talk about disruptive innovation and share with you some of the experience that I've had over the last decade or so in this space, and hopefully pass on some of the hard-won lessons that I've learnt. Before I get into that, maybe just a little bit about my personal journey, how I sort of ended up here. I grew up in Adelaide. I'm an Adelaide boy, grew up in the western suburbs. I got my first piece of technology, my first PC, when I was just 8 years old. My father bought back a VIC-20 computer from the Computer Electronics Show in Las Vegas. That was kind of exciting at that point. I had computers growing up throughout my childhood. I was quite fortunate. I've got to say, mostly for games. I've got to kind of make that confession. But it was sort of in the late 80s when I got my first summer job in high school, where I worked at Cast Alloy in North Plympton, which is an aluminium foundry, for those of you that don't know it. I worked in the metallurgical laboratory in the engineering section. And that was the first time I really got exposed to business processes and really started to understand what amazing opportunity technology had to make business so much more efficient and capable. And I also experienced just how difficult it is to communicate the potential and the reasons to act on those kind of things with senior managers there. And I think it's those two sort of themes which really set my trajectory for my career. One is looking at what is the potential of technology, and also how do you communicate that in a much more relatable way to people that inspires them to act and makes them feel safe to act when they're taking on new projects. So after I spent some time at Castle, we eventually had some success in getting some systems in place. I attended Flinders University for a time, didn't quite get my degree, but had a lot of fun there, learnt a ton of stuff, studied science, started a computer business while I was there. Then for the next 10 years, I spent a bunch of time here in Adelaide working for different businesses in the information technology space. Mostly in the corporate sector, doing a bunch of interesting things. And then at the end of the 90s, I joined Microsoft here in Adelaide. And that was a really interesting experience. And Bill Gates was still CEO at that point in time. There was only 3 people in the office. I eventually moved to Singapore to be part of the regional team, looking after Asia Pacific, joined the senior leadership team there. That was a multi-billion-dollar business at that point in time. Got some unbelievable experience in many countries across Asia, and really learnt the different cultural aspects of introducing technologies into many different industries. And I had some very interesting roles there in terms of competitive strategy and eventually also looking after entrepreneurship and innovation for Microsoft across the region. And that was a huge learning curve after spending nearly 10 years focusing primarily on the government and corporate space, teaching corporate executives how to implement technology and how to think about the future of innovation within their company context and with governments. And when you're dealing with a couple of people with an idea, they don't have a product team, they don't have a marketing department, they don't have a legal department, they don't have a finance department. It's a wildly different proposition. It was a huge learning curve for me to understand, how do you enable these people? How do you help them be successful? How do you help them to achieve the vision that they want to achieve? I spent a number of years doing that and had a lot of success. And then I eventually left Microsoft in 2011 to start to do this operationally inside some of these companies and working with startups in Singapore, helping them move across to Singapore to Silicon Valley, became an angel investor, learned about that whole new world of investment, helping those companies establish their centers over in the United States, help them develop product teams, help them connect with customers. Fortune 500 corporations wanted to implement technology. And I had a fantastic experience. And then just last year, decided to come back here to Adelaide. And so it's that entire journey, particularly in the last half of my career, that I learned just a ton about this concept of disruptive innovation and what that means. And I think this is really relevant to all of us going forward, how we think about transitioning to the new economy. And really what I wanted to do is share some of that. While I'm back in Adelaide, I've co-founded a business here, and we're really focused on this area. We're very, very early stage. We've got a few customers, but we're trying to solve the problem for people that are trying to build hyper-growth businesses and people that are trying to build startups, help them understand what that journey looks like, help make that journey more achievable, affordable and accessible, because it's a difficult one. But let me share now with you some of the learnings that I've had along my path. If you're not familiar with this picture, this robot is called Big Dog by a company called Boston Dynamics that Google bought in 2014, I think. If you ever want to know the trajectory of robotics, go onto YouTube and look up Big Dog and just have a look at the successive years of videos that this company puts out to show you what these robots can do. It's really mind-blowing how quickly the progress is occurring. And you could do a very similar thing for cognitive computing or machine learning, and you get a very quick sense of just how much these kind of technologies are going to impact business going forward. And that's something that I think in the past with different computing revolutions and the internet and so forth was much more of a kind of an optional thing that we could be involved with, we could kind of think about a bit later. But I think the thing that's really different now is that this is kind of a mandatory involvement. These technologies are just affecting so many industries at such pace that we really all have to get involved. We all have to understand the implications and we all have to help and support each other. This is not just a case of a few people competing to sort of create the next wave. I think it's up to all of us now to help each other to figure out how do we survive this paradigm leap, as I call it. It's not just a paradigm shift, it's a real paradigm leap. And some of the challenges that we need to overcome as a community is to start to think about what does it mean to build these new economy businesses? What is it that we need? We need some skills in things like robotics and machine learning, of course, but it's more than those technical skills, it's also culture and mindset. So understanding that these new economy businesses are much more focused on intellectual capital than they are on physical assets, and getting comfortable with that, because it's a very uncomfortable kind of transition if you've not managed a business in this intellectual capital space where you can't go count your stock on your shelf, for example. So it's a different mindset. Also the mindset shift where we're moving from much more hierarchical management structures to much more peer-based management structures where we've got cross-functional teams getting together. Sometimes those cross-functional teams exist across organisational boundaries. How do you become an effective leader when you don't have authoritarian control? How do you influence and inspire and bring people together? And it's a real skill set that's required in these kind of companies. And then the last one is the competitive mindset shift. And I think this is really relevant at this point in time because a lot of the old economy businesses, if we can call them that, it's been a real case of compete and defend, because for me to win, that means that someone else has to lose. But in the new economy businesses, because we're talking about information and bits that can be copied and replicated, the culture of competition is much more about collaboration and outpacing people. So the best thing you can do is find somebody, share your idea with them and work together to take it global. And that's a really different mindset. It's a mindset that is all about openness, and I think very relevant and certainly very different from where I come from. When I started my career was much more about not sharing ideas and competing through defending. I've also learned that there are different kinds of innovation. So disruptive innovation is only one kind of innovation, and it's these other kinds of innovation that tend to be more predominant, sustaining and optimizing innovations. I think Clayton Christensen from Harvard Business School describes these best. But essentially, this idea of sustaining innovation and optimizing innovation is when you've got existing business models and you've got existing products and you're improving them. You're either making them more effective or more efficient. And as corporate executives or investors, we feel very safe putting our investments behind these kind of innovations because they're not as risky. This whole disruptive innovation space is high risk. So very naturally, we shy away from those things. So less effort and energy, and I think less experience and understanding exists in this disruptive space because just naturally the marketplace has a bias against these things. But it's this disruptive innovation and building a capability in this disruptive innovation which is what's going to leap us into the next phase, into the new economy. And so I think we need to share understandings and build up a capability within our community around how we successfully do disruptive innovation and manage the risk associated with it. Something else I've learned is that we're going through this solution explosion period. I think some people have referred to the information technology point in time at the moment as the Cambrian explosion, which basically means there are so many solution opportunities out there. And this kind of, some may say flippant example from Wired magazine last week, which originated from a design firm in Melbourne, is an idea for LED lit sidewalks. So as you're playing Pokemon Go, you don't need to look up to see the pedestrian crosswalk sign. But flippant it may be, but it just shows you that every solution that gets created, that creates new opportunity. Every piece of technology that gets created, that creates opportunity. So the opportunity space is actually expanding, which I think is a very exciting thing. And certainly we know the capital space is also expanding. So I think BBC ran an article last year saying the number of billionaires and millionaires on the planet is going to increase by something like 30% in the next 10 to 15 years. So we know that ideas are plentiful, we know that capital is plentiful. The biggest limiting factor in this whole space is great quality execution. And that's what we need to get really good at and share an understanding amongst the community of how to execute really, really well in this space so that we can all succeed. I've also learned that this is a really exciting space to be in. The opportunities to do something really, really significant are huge. And I think one of my favorite company examples is a company called Grammarly. If you're familiar with that at all, it's an online grammar checker for when you're typing things in a web browser, whether you're using Google Mail or Hotmail or any kind of online form. It sits in your browser and will help check your grammar, which is a fairly minor feature. Previous generation, when I used to sell Microsoft Word, for example, that's one feature in hundreds of features in that product. And here's a company that's come along and just built one feature. They've done a great job at it. They're now worth $100 million. They employ nearly 100 people, and they're doing it globally. It's such a great story of someone that's done something with incredible focus and taken it to the world. And that, to me, just represents the opportunity space that here from Adelaide, we can come up with great solutions and export them to the world. And while that's exciting, and I think some talk about this space as the winner takes all, or talks about this sort of disruptive innovation space as a winner takes all space. And that's certainly true, because if you think about a company like Grammarly, once they've been able to be successful, build a business model, and become profitable and export that to the world, how many other online grammar checkers does the world need? Probably not that many. Which means whoever solves that problem first is likely going to be the winner, and the next company that comes along is probably going to have to solve a different problem. Now we see copycat innovation going on all the time. We see even very successful companies like Uber have got competitors like Didi in China. Interestingly, now they're now merging. But it just goes to show you that these innovations generally only need to be solved once or a few number of times. There's not multiple Facebooks and there's not multiple Twitters. You only need to solve this once. So that's a great thing. If you're on that team, if you're an employee, or if you're an investor, or if you're a customer, and you're on that winning team, that's a wonderful thing. You get all of the benefits associated with that. But there's a flip side of this. If you're not on that team, then this can be a really scary proposition. How do I get involved and engaged in this disruptive innovation space if I'm not on that winning team? And I think it's up to the community to help people get engaged and get connected to this entire space. It's not just enough to create winners. We have to create many winners, and we have to allow people to go around this innovation process multiple times and have multiple goes at it, and make this a very inclusive process. And I'm excited about sort of a couple of conversations that are going on a global level right now. One is the sort of minimum wage idea. I think that makes a tremendous amount of sense to help people not be worried about being left behind by this disruptive innovation. And I think the other thing that's very exciting is this equity-based crowdfunding, because it provides a model to allow people that perhaps might not have the skills at this point in time to start or be involved in these kind of companies. It gives them a vehicle for getting involved with very small amounts of capital that they can afford. Something else I've learned is that this space is all about people. It took me a while to learn this. I spent a lot of time thinking just about the technology. But actually, the most fun about this disruptive innovation space is about the people. When you're building fun, wonderful products and you're solving real problems, you make customers happy. You just have to look at some of the iconic companies like Apple or Tesla or some of these big names that you hear of that have solved fantastic problems, and just how delighted customers are about the experience they're getting from these new products. If you go to any of these workplaces and spend time, if you spend time on the Microsoft campus or the Google campus or the Facebook campus and just have a look at the environment that they've created for employees, it's unbelievable. They're the places that you want to work. They've got unbelievable facilities, support. These are the kind of companies that really attract great talent because of the work environment. And the good news is you don't need to be a large corporate to build these kind of work environments. You can do that really small with a very few number of people. Something else I've learned is that education is being outpaced in this disruptive innovation environment. When I look at the kind of talent that we want to hire in our company, that talent doesn't really exist yet because we are in the forefront. By the very nature of doing disruptive innovation, we can't find people that do what we want to do because it doesn't exist yet because we're creating it. Now that doesn't mean that education is not important. It absolutely is important that people have a fundamental baseline. But what it does mean for all businesses going forward that want to get involved in creating the future is that continuous education and continuous learning on the job is going to be a critical and mandatory part of that company infrastructure. And we've got to figure out a way how to solve that because it's not an easy issue to solve that. And this idea of adult education is just as important on a community level. And I know we talk a lot about K-12 and STEM education, which is absolutely critical and absolutely important and I'm passionate about, but I'm just as passionate about adult education for how we get more people involved in this space. I've also come across this affliction. This particularly afflicts people that are new to this space and having a go for the first time at entrepreneurship or startups. I call it compulsive prototyping disorder. This is when you have an urge or a desire to build a solution. And that may be something that's deep inside of you, or maybe there's a competition going on that compels you to want to build a solution. And you've never actually spoken to a customer, or not enough customers to know if there's a market that you can sell this thing. And we see so much resource being expended by entrepreneurs trying to build solutions before they've ever gone out to the market and found out if that is a problem worth solving and people are going to pay for. And this is probably my top advice for anyone that's thinking about getting into this space, is spend time with your customers. And we know the answer to how to do this. Nina just explained to us how you spend time with your customers, understand what the problem space is, and then build a solution that people really, really need. And finally, probably my hardest lesson, I think, from a financial point of view, is understanding how to manage risk in this space and the importance of portfolios. Now, this is critical if you're an investor. You know, if you're thinking about investing in this space, and it's something that I think is great for everyone to think about and support people that are trying to create the future like this. But please understand what that means in terms of the risk profile of investing in these companies. So if you think you've got some real estate and you've got some other kind of investments, and maybe I'll support a couple of startups, that's a really, really, really bad idea. Because more often than not, over 50% of startups that actually get capital fail. What you need to do is take a portfolio approach. So if you're thinking about this, please connect with people and chat with people, get engaged with other investors that are in this space so that you can learn how to do this safely. Because if it's done safely, it can be very, very profitable and successful. And if you're an entrepreneur, this idea of portfolio of experiments is critical. Thinking that you've got one idea and you're going to go raise some money and solve that problem, using that money to deploy that idea into a business, is really, really dangerous because these ideas evolve so much as you start to work with customers. And that idea changes and morphs. And you may have to run multiple experiments over time to figure out if that idea is actually truly scalable or not. So we have this saying where you've got to survive first to run experiments. Don't run experiments to survive. It doesn't work that way. So hopefully you've got some value out of that. Happy disrupting.